Imagine settling into the seat you worked so hard to earn, ready to relax, only to be stared at like a threat, questioned like a criminal, and dragged off a plane in front of 100 strangers. That is exactly what happened to a 17-year-old boy named Marcus Coleman. He was black. He was young, and one flight attendant decided that was reason enough to humiliate him. But she picked the wrong teenager. And she picked the wrong father. Because when Marcus made one phone call from a cramped jet bridge at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, an entire aircraft loaded with passengers, luggage, and fuel for a 5-hour flight was ordered to stay exactly where it was. Nobody was going anywhere. Not until the truth came out. Stay with me, because this story is not just about one boy's humiliation. It is about power colliding with prejudice, and what happens when the person you underestimate has more strength than you could ever imagine. By the end, you will understand exactly why karma does not always come as lightning. Sometimes it comes as a slow, grinding collapse that a person builds for themselves, one decision at a time. Let's begin. The smell of new leather and recycled cabin air had always given Marcus Coleman a small thrill. This was only the 4th time in his life he had flown first class, a rare privilege that came from his father's relentless travel schedule and the mountain of airline miles it produced. But this flight was different from the others. This one mattered more than any flight he had ever taken. Marcus was flying from Chicago to Seattle to attend an elite 2-week robotics and engineering intensive, the kind of program that colleges like Stanford quietly watched when deciding who deserved a spot in their next incoming class. He had been coding since he was 11. He had built a functioning prosthetic hand prototype in his school's makerspace when he was 15. This camp was not a vacation. It was a doorway, and he intended to walk through it. His father, Solomon Coleman, had walked him to the gate that morning, saying very little, the way he always did when he was proud enough that words felt insufficient. Solomon was a civil rights attorney, a man whose calm exterior hid a will that had broken far larger opponents than an airline. He had built his career representing people who had been wronged by institutions that assumed no one would ever fight back. He kissed his son's forehead, told him to call the moment he landed, and watched him disappear down the jet bridge with the quiet pride of a man who had given his child every tool he never had. Marcus found his seat, 2A, a window seat on the left side of the cabin, exactly the kind he liked, because it let him rest his head against the fuselage and disappear into a book. He lifted his backpack, a scuffed gray one, holding his laptop, his tablet, and a paperback science fiction novel he had been saving for the flight, and slid it neatly into the overhead bin. He wore dark jeans, clean white sneakers, and a plain navy hoodie. Nothing flashy, nothing that should have drawn a single glance from anyone. The cabin was still filling in. A businessman in a gray suit was already typing furiously on a laptop. An older couple murmured quietly to each other, 2 rows back. A woman near the front sipped bottled water and scrolled through her phone. It was, in every visible way, an unremarkable Tuesday morning flight. That was when Marcus first noticed her. Deborah Whitfield had been a flight attendant for 23 years. She wore her authority the way some people wear an old, comfortable coat, so used to it that she no longer questioned whether it fit. Her blonde hair was pulled into a severe bun, and there was a permanent crease between her eyebrows that seemed to deepen the moment her eyes landed on something she had decided did not belong. Her eyes landed on Marcus. She did not see a straight-A student. She did not see a robotics prodigy, or a boy who had spent the last 3 months preparing for the most important 2 weeks of his young life. She saw a young black teenager sitting in first class, and in the space of half a second, some old, poisonous instinct told her that something must be wrong with the picture. "Can I help you, young man?" she asked, her voice syrup-sweet in a way that made the hair on Marcus's arms rise. "No, thank you. "I'm all set," Marcus said, offering the same polite smile he had been taught to offer, since he was old enough to understand why he needed one. Her eyes flicked to his boarding pass, tucked neatly into the seat back pocket, then back to his face. "This is the first-class cabin," she said, as though he might not have noticed the wider seat, the extra legroom, the linen napkin already folded on his tray table. "Yes, ma'am." "Seat 2A," he said, gesturing toward the pass. "I'll need to see that," she said, and something in her tone had already hardened, the sugar gone. He handed it over without argument. She studied it far longer than any boarding pass required studying, turning it over in her hands, as though she expected the ink to be fake. 2 rows back, the businessman had stopped typing. The woman with the water bottle was watching now too, her eyes darting between Marcus and the flight attendant with the particular discomfort of someone who senses a situation forming, but has decided it is not their business to intervene. "Coleman," Deborah said slowly, reading the name aloud like it was evidence of something. "That's me, Marcus Coleman. And you're seated in .2A, Marcus said again, his patience thinning by the second. He was not trying to cause a problem. He simply wanted to read his book and disappear into the flight, the way every other passenger around him was being allowed to do. She handed the pass back without a word of apology, her lips pressed into a thin, unsatisfied line, and moved on to inspect his backpack in the overhead bin, as though it might contain something other than a laptop and a paperback. It did not. She closed the bin a little harder than necessary and walked away. Marcus exhaled, opened his book, and tried to let the encounter slide off him. But it did not slide. It sat in his chest like a stone, because he had felt this exact feeling before, more times than he could count. The subtle interrogation. The unspoken accusation. The quiet, corrosive message that his presence in a nice seat required an explanation that no one else on the plane was being asked to provide. He told himself it was over. It was not over. Over the next 20 minutes, as the cabin continued to fill and the safety briefing played overhead, Deborah found reason after reason to return to his row. She reminded him to buckle a seatbelt that was already buckled. She told him his tray table needed to be stowed, even though he had never touched it. She offered him a children's coloring book with a smirk sharp enough to cut glass, and when he politely declined, she left it on his tray anyway, as though daring him to object. Each visit was small. Each visit, on its own, could be explained away, brushed off, forgiven. But together they formed a pattern that Marcus recognized instantly, because he had grown up learning to recognize exactly this kind of pattern, the way other kids learned to recognize storm clouds. Something was building, and it was building toward him. The final blow came, just as the plane began its slow crawl back from the gate. Deborah reappeared, this time with a gate agent trailing behind her, a nervous-looking man named Gary Preston, who kept glancing at his tablet, as though it might offer him an escape route. Deborah's voice, when she spoke, carried a note of theatrical concern that did not match the triumphant gleam in her eyes. "Sir, I'm afraid there's a discrepancy with your seat assignment. Mr. Preston here needs to verify a few things at the gate." Marcus felt the floor tilt beneath him.
"A discrepancy?"
"I already showed you my boarding pass. It's correct." Gary shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable, clearly relying entirely on whatever Deborah had told him before they walked down the aisle together. "Sir, there's a report that this seat may be double booked. If you could just step off with me, we can clear it up quickly." "We're about to take off," Marcus said, his voice rising despite every effort to keep it level. Heads were turning now. The woman near the front had twisted fully around in her seat to watch. "That's exactly why we need to move fast," Deborah said, her expression settling into something close to satisfaction. "We can't hold the entire flight for one passenger's seating issue." The message underneath her words was unmistakable. He was the problem. He was the delay. He was the inconvenience standing between 200 passengers and their on-time departure. "There is no issue," Marcus said, his voice cracking with a frustration he could no longer hide. "This is my seat. I paid for it. My father—" "Sir, please," Gary cut in, his voice firmer now, propped up by Deborah's certainty, even though his own eyes betrayed doubt. "We don't want to cause a scene. Just come with me." "You're the ones causing a scene," Marcus said, finally losing the calm he had been clinging to since the moment Deborah first approached him. "If you don't cooperate," Deborah said, her voice dropping into something low and final, "we will have to remove you for being a disruptive passenger." The words landed like a slap. Marcus looked around the cabin, searching for a single face that might come to his defense. No one met his eyes. The businessman looked down at his laptop. The older couple studied their hands. In that moment, surrounded by dozens of people, Marcus Coleman had never felt more completely alone. "Fine," he said, his voice tight, with a fury he refused to let break into tears. He unbuckled the seatbelt Deborah had fixed twice already and stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. He would not give her the satisfaction of watching him fall apart, no matter how badly the injustice burned in his chest. As he stepped into the aisle, Deborah allowed herself the smallest, most infuriating smile. He was being marched out of first class, in front of every single person on that plane, and she was enjoying it. The walk from row 2 to the aircraft door felt endless. Marcus could feel the stares crawling over his skin, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and, in a few faces, that quiet, ugly assumption that he must have done something to deserve this. Deborah trailed behind him, like a warden escorting a prisoner, her presence a constant, smug reminder that she had won. Once they reached the privacy of the jet bridge, Gary's hard edge softened almost immediately. "Look, kid," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "I'm sure this is just a mix-up. Let's head to the desk and sort it out." Marcus wasn't listening anymore. The humiliation and rage inside him had reached a boiling point. And there was only one person on Earth he wanted to hear his voice right now. He pulled out his phone. "Who are you calling?" Gary asked, a flicker of nervousness crossing his face. "My father," Marcus said, and for the first time since Deborah had approached his seat, there was something steady in his voice again. 3 rings, then the deep, even voice that had calmed courtrooms far more hostile than a boarding gate. "Marcus? What's wrong?" And Marcus, standing in that narrow jet bridge, with his hands shaking and his throat tight, told his father everything. The staring, the questioning, the fabricated seat discrepancy, the public walk of shame. The word disruptive, used against a boy who had done nothing but exist in a seat he had legally, rightfully paid for. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Solomon Coleman spoke again, his voice had dropped into a register. Marcus had heard only a handful of times in his life, the voice his father used right before he destroyed an opposing counsel in a deposition. "Put the gate agent on the phone." Gary blinked, startled, but took the phone when Marcus extended it toward him. "This is Gary Preston. I'm the gate agent for Mr. Preston," Solomon interrupted, his tone calm, controlled, and absolutely unyielding. "My name is Solomon Coleman. I am an attorney. My son has just described being racially profiled, harassed, and removed from a paid first-class seat without any legitimate cause. I want the name of the flight attendant involved, the flight number, and I want to speak to the highest-ranking supervisor on duty in that airport within the next 5 minutes. If that plane pushes back before this is resolved, I promise you, it will be the single most expensive departure in this airline's history." Gary's face went pale. He glanced toward Deborah, who was watching the exchange with the first flicker of uncertainty crossing her expression. "Sir, let me get my supervisor," Gary stammered, already turning to keys the radio on his belt. Within minutes, word had traveled up the chain faster than anyone in that terminal could have predicted. Solomon Coleman was not simply an angry parent. He was the senior partner of a firm that had, 3 years earlier, won a landmark discrimination settlement against a national hotel chain, a case that had made headlines and forced sweeping policy changes across the hospitality industry. His name carried weight in exactly the rooms that mattered most right now. He did not raise his voice once during the 15-minute phone call that followed with the airport's regional operations manager. He did not need to. He simply laid out, with the precision of a man who had spent 20 years building airtight arguments, exactly what had happened, exactly what laws and internal policies had likely been violated, and exactly what would happen next if this was treated as anything less than a serious incident. Meanwhile, back on the aircraft, something extraordinary was unfolding. Captain Ava Whitcomb, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for running a tight, respectful cabin, had been alerted by a flight attendant who had witnessed the entire encounter and quietly reported it to the cockpit rather than staying silent. Captain Whitcomb made a decision that would later be studied in airline training programs across the country. She refused to push back from the gate. "We are not taking off," she told her first officer, "until I understand exactly what just happened to that boy." Over the intercom, passengers heard an announcement they had never heard before on a commercial flight.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking.
"We are experiencing a short delay while we resolve a passenger service matter. I appreciate your patience." What the passengers did not know yet was that the entire aircraft had effectively been grounded because of what one flight attendant had done to one 17-year-old boy. Word spread through the cabin in whispers. The businessman who had stopped typing earlier leaned toward his seatmate. "Did you see that kid get pulled off? I think that's why we're not moving." The woman near the front, the one who had watched the entire confrontation without saying a word, suddenly found her phone in her hand, opening a video app, scrolling back through footage she had discreetly recorded of Deborah's final confrontation with Marcus. She had filmed it not because she planned to use it, but out of the instinctive discomfort of watching something she knew was wrong. Now, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding, she quietly sent the clip to a local news tip line, just in case. Back in the terminal, Solomon Coleman arrived at the gate area within 20 minutes. Still in the suit he had worn to drop his son off that morning, his expression a mask of controlled fury that made even the airport security officer nearby take a half step back. He found Marcus sitting in a plastic gate chair, jaw tight, eyes red-rimmed but dry. He knelt in front of his son, placed both hands on his shoulders, and asked one question.
Are you okay?
"I'm fine, Dad. I just want to get to camp." "You will," Solomon said. "But first, we're going to make sure this never happens to another kid on this airline again." By now, the regional operations manager, a harried woman named Patricia N. Kemalu, had arrived at the gate personally, along with an airport duty manager, and trailing behind them with a face like a man walking to his own execution, Deborah Whitfield. "Mr. Coleman," Patricia began, "I want to personally apologize for what your son experienced today. We are taking this extremely seriously." "I'm sure you are, now that a lawyer is standing in front of you," Solomon said evenly. "But my son didn't experience a mix-up. He experienced discrimination. I want your internal complaint file on this flight attendant. I want to know if this is the first time, because I have a strong suspicion it is not. It was not." Within the hour, as the airline's internal affairs team pulled Deborah Whitfield's personnel file under mounting pressure, a pattern began to emerge that no one had bothered to connect before. 4 prior complaints over the past 6 years, every single one involving a passenger of color, every single one quietly settled with a generic apology letter and a note in a file that nobody with real authority had ever read closely. Deborah Whitfield had not slipped once. She had been doing this for years, and the airline's own indifference had allowed it. When confronted with this history in a private room near the gate, Deborah's carefully composed expression finally cracked. "I was just doing my job," she said, her voice rising in defensive panic. "I had a bad feeling about that seat, that's all. I didn't do anything different than I would with any passenger." "4 complaints, Miss Whitfield," Patricia said quietly, sliding the file across the table. 4, all flagged the exact same behavior pattern. "Are you telling me that's a coincidence?" Deborah said nothing. For the first time in the entire ordeal, she had no smug retort waiting. Outside in the gate area, passengers from Flight 458 had begun deplaning voluntarily, the delay stretching long enough that the airline made the call to fully cancel the flight and rebook everyone rather than risk sending Deborah back onto that aircraft. As 200 frustrated but increasingly curious passengers filed off the plane, several of them approached Marcus and Solomon directly. "I saw the whole thing," the businessman said, extending his hand to Marcus. "You didn't deserve that, not even a little bit." "Neither did the other people whose complaints got buried," Solomon said quietly, mostly to himself, already thinking 3 moves ahead the way he always did. By that evening, the woman's video clip had reached a local news producer, and by the next morning, it had been picked up by a national outlet. The headline was blunt and impossible to scroll past. "Teen pulled from first-class seat. Entire flight ground after father's call expose pattern of discrimination." The story exploded. Within 72 hours, the airline, a mid-sized national carrier called Skyline Airways, found itself facing a public relations catastrophe unlike anything in its 30-year history. Social media users dug up old, forgotten complaints from other passengers who had experienced similar treatment and never had the resources or the platform to be heard. A former flight attendant came forward, describing an internal culture where certain crew members were known among colleagues for profiling. A quiet, ugly, open secret that management had allowed to fester, because addressing it seemed like more trouble than it was worth. Skyline's CEO, a controlled and image-conscious executive named Richard Ashford, called an emergency press conference less than a week later. He stood at a podium, flanked by legal counsel and a hastily hired crisis communications team, and delivered an apology that was, by every measure, too little, arriving far too late to undo the damage already spreading across every major news outlet in the country. Solomon Coleman did not accept a quiet settlement behind closed doors, though the airline offered one almost immediately, hoping to make the story disappear before it could do further damage. He refused. "My son isn't for sale," he told reporters gathered outside the courthouse the week the lawsuit was formally filed. "This was never about money. It's about making sure no other family has to go through what mine did." The case became the story of the season. Legal analysts called it one of the clearest civil rights violations they had seen from a major airline in over a decade, given the sheer volume of internal evidence, the buried complaint history, and video documentation that left no room for the airline's lawyers to argue ambiguity. 6 months later, Skyline Airways settled for a figure that made headlines on its own. A sum large enough to fund not just compensation for Marcus and his family, but a sweeping set of mandatory reforms across the entire airline. Every flight attendant would undergo new bias awareness training. An independent review board, staffed partly by civil rights advocates, would be granted permanent oversight of discrimination complaints. A confidential reporting hotline would be established for both passengers and employees, protected from the kind of quiet burial that had let Deborah Whitfield's pattern continue for years. And Deborah Whitfield herself was terminated, effective immediately. Her 23-year career erased in a single afternoon meeting that lasted less than 10 minutes. She did not go quietly. In the weeks that followed her firing, Deborah gave a handful of interviews to anyone who would have her, insisting she had been made into a scapegoat, that she was simply following her instincts, that people were too sensitive now, that the world had turned against people like her for doing nothing more than their job. She leaned into the anger, because the anger was easier than the alternative, which was looking directly at what she had done and understanding why she had done it. But the anger did not pay her rent. Without her pension, without her seniority, without the identity she had spent 2 decades building around a blue uniform and a badge of quiet authority, Deborah Whitfield found herself 8 months after that morning at the gate, working the register at a grocery store, 40 minutes from the small apartment she had been forced to downsize into. The customers were impatient. The pay barely covered her bills. The job that had once made her feel important, trusted, in control of who belonged and who did not, was gone, replaced by scanning barcodes for people who barely looked at her twice. It was there on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, nearly a year after that flight, that she saw Captain Ava Whitcomb walk into the store. Their eyes met across the checkout aisle. Whitcomb, still in her airline uniform, clearly on her way home from a layover, recognized her instantly. There was no anger in the captain's expression, no triumph. Just a quiet, heavy sadness that somehow felt far worse than anything cruel could have been. Deborah looked away first. Her face burned. She rang up the captain's items with trembling hands and said nothing, and Whitcomb said nothing either, and that silence sat between them like a verdict. Neither of them needed to speak aloud. That night, for the first time since the day she was fired, Deborah did not reach for anger. She sat alone in her small apartment and finally let herself ask the question she had been avoiding for a year. Why had she looked at a 17-year-old boy in a window seat and felt threatened? Why had 4 different passengers over 6 years triggered the same instinct in her? And why had she never once stopped to interrogate that instinct instead of trusting it? She thought about her own father, a man who had made comments at the dinner table throughout her entire childhood that she'd had never once questioned. Comments that had quietly calcified into the very instincts she called experience for 23 years. She thought about the colleagues she had surrounded herself with, the ones who nodded along whenever she complained about passengers who made her uncomfortable, an echo chamber that had told her, over and over, that her instincts were not prejudice. They were simply professionalism. They were not professionalism. She understood that now, sitting alone in an apartment far smaller than the life she used to have, and understanding it did not undo a single thing she had done. It simply meant she would have to carry it, fully and honestly, for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, Marcus Coleman's story had taken on a life far beyond that one difficult morning at O'Hare. He completed his 2 weeks at the robotics intensive in Seattle, arriving 4 days late because of the ordeal, but arriving nonetheless. And the program directors, having heard exactly what had happened to him, made sure he never once felt like he had to explain or justify his place among the other students. He was accepted to Stanford the following spring, and in his application essay, he did not write about the humiliation of that morning. He wrote about the phone call, about the exact moment his father's voice, steady and unshakable, had reminded him that being made to feel small did not mean he was small, and that dignity was not something anyone could take from him without his permission, no matter how hard they tried. Solomon Coleman's advocacy did not stop with the settlement. He founded a nonprofit called Just Passage, dedicated to monitoring discrimination complaints across the airline industry and providing free legal support to passengers who had nowhere near his resources or standing. Within 2 years, citing the Skyline case directly, the Department of Transportation issued updated guidelines requiring airlines to track and publicly report discrimination complaints on an annual basis, closing the exact loophole that had allowed Deborah Whitfield's 4-year pattern to go unnoticed. Gary Preston, the gate agent who had reluctantly followed Deborah's lead that morning, went through his own retraining and eventually became one of the most well-regarded customer service trainers in the company, known for a single piece of advice he gave to every new hire. If someone tells you to distrust your own eyes because of the color of a passenger's skin, don't just follow along because it's easier. Ask why. Always ask why. Skyline Airways, battered but forced into genuine change, slowly rebuilt its reputation over the following years, not through slogans or hollow apologies, but through measurable outcomes that outside watchdog groups eventually acknowledged as some of the most serious reform efforts in the industry. It took years. It cost the company tens of millions of dollars. But it happened because one father refused to let one phone call become just another quiet, forgotten injustice. As for Marcus, now a sophomore at Stanford studying computer engineering, he still remembers the particular chill of standing in that jet bridge, phone shaking in his hand, waiting to hear his father's voice. He still double-checks his boarding pass before every flight, still keeps a screenshot saved on his phone as a small, quiet ritual of self-protection that he has never quite been able to let go of. Some scars do not disappear. They simply stop controlling you. But he also remembers what came after. The apology that mattered less than the accountability that followed it. The strangers who found their courage a little too late, and the ones, like the woman with the phone, who found it just in time. The way his father took one of the worst mornings of his life and turned it into a blueprint that protected people neither of them would ever meet. And Deborah Whitfield, wherever she is today, carries something that no lawsuit and no settlement could ever fully account for. Not a headline, not a punishment handed down by a judge. Something quieter and, in its own way, far heavier. The daily knowledge of exactly who she chose to be on one ordinary Tuesday morning, and exactly what that choice cost everyone around her, including, in the end, herself. Her karma was never going to arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrived slowly, the way real consequences almost always do, in a smaller apartment, a quieter life, and a mirror she could no longer avoid looking into. This story, born from one boy's humiliation on one ordinary flight, went on to change how an entire airline trained its employees, how a federal agency tracked complaints, and how thousands of passengers who will never know Marcus Coleman's name were treated with a little more dignity because of what happened to him. It is a reminder that prejudice, no matter how quietly it hides behind procedure and policy, has no place in the sky or anywhere else on this earth. And it is a reminder that standing up, even when your voice is shaking, even when no one else in the room will meet your eyes, can be the very first step toward a change far bigger than yourself. What would you have done if you were sitting in that cabin, watching it happen? Would you have looked away, the way most of those passengers did? Or would you have been the one person willing to speak up before it was too late? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and if this story moved you, stay close. Because there are more stories like this one still waiting to be told.